Hi, my name is Johannes Schindelin. I'm the maintainer of Git for Windows, and I would like to talk to you about Git for Windows today and about the challenges we face with cross-platform collaboration, because as probably most of you know, Git for Windows is not Git. It's just a friendly fork, and Git originally is only for Linux. So this is a fantastic title for a rock band. Please don't take it. I still plan to use it at some stage. First of all, let me start by illustrating a little bit the history of Git, or maybe not so much of Git, but me with a Git project, and as a consequence, Git for Windows with a Git project. First of all, the Git project was born out of a need by the Linux project, and it was targeting Linux not only as a user, but also as a platform to run on. And that unfortunately informed on many of the decisions in the past, and unfortunately also in the present, which poses a substantial problem. Now, Linux is not Unix, right? And even if it's very similar, when I started to work on Git, I actually had to work on an IRIX machine. That's a silicon graphics machine. Back then, they were super expensive. Now, any graphics adapter can probably do the same as they could. The only thing is that maybe they had a little bit faster, bigger memory, but that's it. And they ran on the operating system called IRIX. IRIX is a fork of Unix, and so it's adapted. It was adapted by SGI, and I faced challenges to run Git on IRIX. The major problem there was that all the tool chain that Git assumed was present wasn't there. So we did have a Perl that was running on IRIX, but it was not the newest Perl. We did have a shell, a Unix shell, but it was not Bash. And we did not have Python. Back in those days, Git was implemented not only in C, but a large part as shell scripts, a minor part as Perl scripts, and a very central part as Python script. And that central part that was merge. So I have plenty of experience there to work on a platform that was not really supported by Git, but it was not yet Windows. It was very similar to Linux, but not quite identical. So I have the experience there. And when I started to work as a freelancer in a Windows shop, which is funny, by the way, because back in those days, in 2006, I was fairly squarely a Linux fanboy. I had switched to Linux on my machine in 1994. That's when I deleted the Windows partition and put all kinds of open source projects on there and started developing there. I for a couple of years there, I even ran in console mode only, in text mode, not in graphics mode, because my machine was so slow. So in 2006, I was working in a Windows shop because I was paid to work on Windows. Otherwise, you could not have made me use Windows. And I regretted this choice very quickly because I had to use Subversion, which was a step up from what they used in that Windows shop before. That was Visual Source Safe. Not a good experience. And Subversion still was not my favorite because I already was involved with a Git project. So what did I do? I installed Git SVN. And of course, I could not install a native Git SVN because there was no Windows support in Git. However, what was there is Cygwin. Cygwin is a system that allows you to run almost all of the Linux software on Windows. You just have to recompile it using the very same toolchain that you're used to from Linux. Like the GNU-C compiler, you have Perl. They regularly update things, so you have the newest versions. Python wouldn't have been a problem there. I would not even have had to port it from Python to pure C just for that Windows. The problem with Cygwin is every program that Cygwin compiles and runs uses the Cygwin runtime. And the Cygwin runtime is a POSIX emulation layer. So basically it pretends that there is a large part of what's available in Linux and in Unix out of the box and is not on Windows. It pretends that all that is there, but it comes at a steep price. And the steep price is the speed leaves a lot of room for improvement. Let's put it that way. So it's really slow. Nevertheless, Git SVN made me really efficient with the whole system because I could hone my patches and I could rebase them. And then when they were done and when I could prove that everything worked all right, and I had done the pre-review of individual commits, which is nice because the individual commits are structured as you should in the separation of concern style, where it's easy to review because everything there makes sense. It tells a story. This is the change I want to make, and this, all that needs to be made. So I pre-reviewed that, and it worked. And it worked much faster than my then manager thought it should work. And unfortunately, this part I was working on was important for a different department in that company that was not really friendly with my manager. So I was asked to hold off my development for a moment. So what did I do? I occupied myself differently, and I thought, how hard can this really be to port Git to native Windows? By the way, if you ever hear me say, how hard could this possibly be, please remind me that I don't want to ask this question again, because invariably I get stuck with these things for decades, as in this case, because first of all, I researched what could I do. So one part of the problem was porting Git to Windows is impossible. Fair and square, it's impossible because a large part of Git is implemented as shell scripts. And there is no native shell script interpreter on Windows. The closest I got was a port of Bash to a port of the Cygwin runtime. That's this MSys project. And I used that, and I tried to keep the rest as native as possible. So I tried to compile Git on a GNU-C compiler that only targets Windows, so the Win32 APIs, and not Cygwin or POSIX or Linux or Unix. And I got to some point where I could compile it, I could run it. It did not quite interact well with the shell and with the pager, so the program that takes the output and presents it to you page by page. So for example, if you run git log, you first see the first page, and then you're supposed to hit the space bar in order to scroll to the next page. And this pager did not understand my port of Git, and therefore it said, oh, can't do that, and scroll through the entire history all the time. That's not really useful, but the rest worked. I could commit, I could I could even inspect the history as long as I avoided the need for a pager. So at some stage, I was successful with my project, with my freelancing gig, and it was done. And I did no longer have access to a Windows computer. As I said, I was a Linux fanboy. There was definitely no Windows in my house. So I sent those patches that I made, after brushing them up a little bit, to the Git mailing list and said, this is working almost. I don't have the capacity nor the opportunity to develop this further. But if somebody wants, here they are, the patches, go right to town. Now, I didn't hear anything back, so I was like, okay. Apparently those Windows people, they are really the worst, right? So the Windows users, they don't do anything. But half a year later, somebody who shares my first name, the same first name as I, came back and said, I got it to work. Here are the patches, which was really cool. So I was quite happy that my work hadn't just gone to waste. Now, that was sometime in spring 2007. And in August 2007, somebody else wrote, so I'm a Windows user and you have those patches, but I couldn't get it to work. What's the system what are the programs I need to compile this? because they didn't have the GNU-C compiler, they didn't have the MSys bash, they didn't have the GNU make system that we needed in order to build all the stuff individually, all the source code. And so I said, you know what? I can help you. I will give you a big zip file of all that. And in return, you maintain this fork of Git for Windows. So they took this and said, that's great. That it works. Good. And I'm not going to maintain this. So I kind of was stuck with maintaining Git for Windows. Which was maybe the first glimpse I had into the cross-platform collaboration challenges. Because so far I mainly had the challenges of collaborating within the Git project on Linux, essentially. But there, this mentality of, you give me something, and now I have what I want. So that's the end of the transaction. I don't give you anything back. That was something that was very new to me, and I have to admit I was not very happy about it. So I tried to get rid of the maintainership of Git for Windows for years. It was quite challenging to keep motivated working on with, especially with those type of users who did not want to give anything back. And at that stage, I was really fiercely this tit for tat thing. Like, you give me something, I give you something in return. It needs to be fair. It needs to be just. But a couple of years later, somebody contacted me and said, well, you know, do you know anybody who knows Git for Windows and could develop it professionally? Because I have a contact inside Microsoft who needs somebody like that. And I said, well, yeah, I know somebody like that, me. So I interviewed with Microsoft, which some of my friends at that stage said, Johannes, you love Linux, you hate Microsoft. What's wrong with you? But I was up for a new challenge at that stage. And it turned out that it was the people there amazed me, not only by their technical virtues, but also by the way they thought about open source. Satya Nadella just had taken over as the steward of Microsoft, and it made an impression on me. So I said, I would love to work with you. And it took a little bit back and forth, over a year to be precise, because I live in Germany and I wanted to be remote. And at that stage, there was no corona, so nobody was working from home. And it was kind of, they said, that's not working. And I said, well, I would work. Then the managers there said, we believe you, but my manager doesn't believe it. So they convinced their manager and then their manager, and then they tried to work it out with HR. And eventually I started work at Microsoft in August 2015. That's 8 years later than I started this project by mistake. And now by not so mistake at all, I first released the first non-preview version of Git for Windows, because now I was working on it full time, and I had a really good feeling about being able to bring this out of the hacky stage into, yes, this is usable product stage. But it was part of the deal with Microsoft that this is not a Microsoft product. It never was, it never will be. This is maintained as an open source project. They pay me to maintain this, but there is no ownership involved. I was really adamant about this, and they were really happy about this too, because they wanted to try a new approach with the open source community, this collaborative approach. And I was really happy about that. It was also the opportunity to work really in a very focused manner on trying to improve things that had been languishing for a long time. For example, there was no 64-bit version of Git for Windows. There was, Git for Windows was still based on MSys, which had not been developed in years. It stagnated. There was no Unicode support in it. So you could basically forget about having any encodings other than ASCII in your repositories, right? So that was not good. Also, the the project didn't have a real good terminal. So this console window. So we had to use CMD, and there were many problems with CMD that we couldn't quite overcome. And with the MSys2 project, which basically redid MSys, it reforked Cygwin, the Cygwin runtime, and tried to apply just a thin layer of patches on top. And it actually not only did that, it also tried to be in sync with Cygwin. So whenever a new Cygwin version comes out, a new MSys2 runtime version comes out. And that really convinced me as something excellent to support and to contribute to. And they also had what I like to call a really excellent terminal, where you can resize and resizes, and you can copy the text as you think and not just rectangles like in the original CMD version that we had. That's MinTTY. So I was really happy about all those things, and I think the users started to be really happy about this too. Now, developing Git for Windows it comes with a lot of challenges. It comes with the challenges like the Git project. They never bothered to introduce an abstraction layer, like saying file access. File access is done via the POSIX functions like open and fopen. So POSIX is this standard by which many Unix implementations and Linux and FreeBSD abide, and Windows does not. Windows NT originally had a POSIX subsystem, so everything there to support POSIX functionality as of 2001 is in the Windows NT kernel, not Windows 95, but Windows NT. But that POSIX subsystem had been discontinued at some stage, and you had to buy it anyway. So we don't have POSIX. So what we do in Git for Windows is we try to emulate this. And we try to emulate this not by introducing a new abstraction layer where you say, okay, now we want to access this part and that part of a file, and we can do this either by the Unix or by the Windows APIs. No, we use the Unix APIs, the POSIX APIs, and we emulate them on top of Windows, but we basically provide the same function signatures, the same functionality as POSIX, which comes at a price. It comes at the price that sometimes we have to implement certain things that the caller doesn't even need. So for example, if you want to get to the metadata of a file, like file size, or is this executable, or does this exist, right? That is the stat POSIX syscall. That does not really exist on Windows. On Windows, you can ask, does this file exist? But then you get the answer yes or no. You can ask the question, what is the file size of this? And there come a couple more information about this. But for example, to get the information, is this a symbolic link? You need to call yet another function. So in order to emulate stat, we have to call all these functions and fill in the information into the object that's returned. And then in many cases, Git just says, oh, so the file exists. So we did a lot of things that are totally unnecessary just to avoid introducing that abstraction layer into Git. Back in those days, when I started the project, this was exactly how I wanted, because I hated Microsoft. I hated Windows, right? I just did this because I was bored and I had time. But in the meantime, I think it would have been wiser to spend that time to introduce that abstraction layer. But then I would probably not even have started the project if that had been the case. So this is a challenge, because on the Git mailing list, you still see the people being completely fine with this approach, because they don't have to worry about anything Windowsy. They just use their Linux stuff and be done with it. And we in the Git for Windows project have to struggle with adapting it and making it work. Another thing that's another challenge with this mindset of I am on Linux or I am on Unix is that you think that spawning a new process is really super cheap. And on Windows, it just is not. On Linux, it's actually not really super cheap because it cheats and copies the things that it needs only later. And then it doesn't duplicate them. So that's very cheap, and so it's fast. The biggest problem there is that with this mindset that you spawn processes instead of spawning, say, threads, which are supported really well on Windows and not so on Linux, because the Linux maintainer originally thought that threads are not even necessary. It took years to convince them that threads are something that needs to be supported by Linux, and it's still kind of not a very smooth experience on Linux. But these threads have the really good advantage that you can have proper locking between threads. They can access the exact same memory. So if you need to parallelize work, threads are actually the better model. And just because the people who work on Linux are not used to thinking in that inside that model, parallelizing is kind of a challenge in Git. Recently, for example, there has been the implementation of parallelizing Git checkout. When you have something like 100 million of files, that can make a lot of sense. And how is it parallelized? By having parallel processes that don't crosstalk. They can't, because that's super expensive and not portable in the first place. So this poses a challenge, because then it's quite obvious to see that these different processes can completely stumble over each other. For example, one process might now thrash this part of the pack files and try to open them all the time. And then this process tries to take that part of the pack files. And they basically hog the I/O of the CPU, the input-output performance. So they hog the bus, and the CPU does not do much of anything except for waiting all the time, because those two processes basically hinder each other from performing well. With threads, that would have been better. So this is not, I'm coming here to one of the learnings. Cross-platform collaboration not only poses challenges, but also opportunities. And this is something that I think the Git project still has to learn. Another thing that was a major, or is a major problem, is the terminal. Like in Git for Windows, you have originally CMD, and now you have Mint TTY, so you have something like these colors, right? But now there's this new Windows terminal, and it also has many, many colors, text colors that you can make, but you can't make them necessarily with the same system as on Linux. You first have to switch a flip, and then flip a switch, and then you can use those escape sequences that are very special. So you basically send a couple of bytes to that terminal, and it turns them into color. But without flipping that switch, you don't get those. You get ugly characters that look like ASCII but are basically useless and are definitely not colorful. So these things, the original Git project just didn't bother about. Why you can't use escape sequences? What platform is this, right? So another challenge where you have to say, this is not the whole wide world. There are more developers working on Windows than there are on Linux. Please, reality check, right? Then also line endings. Originally, the DOS operating system didn't allow line endings other than first a carriage return, which for a printer was to go back to the beginning of the line, and then a line feed, which means move forward. So arguably, this is correct, because you don't move back and then immediately go forward. Sometimes you want to stay right there. But on Linux, if you do a line feed, it automatically goes back. On Windows, it's different, right? But those line endings, they are different, but in the Git repository, we now have to always convert to Unix line endings, which obviously poses problems, because on Linux, they don't care. So sometimes you have things where binary data is mistreated as text, and they don't realize because it's converted from line feed to line feed, nothing done. On Windows, it corrupts the binary data, and your JPEG doesn't load anymore. Another thing is symbolic links. Symbolic links, that might actually have been a little bit of a problem on the Windows side, because there have been many decisions that are questionable and that arguably were designed to cause problems and to lock into the platform. Nowadays, we do have symbolic links, but they have types. So on Windows, you can have a symbolic link that goes to a directory, and it's marked as such. And you can have a symbolic link that goes to a file, and it's marked as such. And if you just create a symbolic link, you have, without the target existing, you can't even deduce from the target what it is. You have to know it. And so you have to specify it. On Linux, you just say symbolic link and whatever it is. It could be a file, and you could later change that to a directory, and works. So the very simplistic model in Git does not allow for it to be specific to target a file or a directory. The biggest challenge of cross-platform collaboration, so cross-platform development, is probably the path problem, because remember how I said there is no native shell, no native Unix shell on Windows. So we use the msys2 bash, which pretends that paths look like they look on Linux or Unix. So absolute paths start with a /. Separators are only /. They are never backslashes. On Windows, on the other hand, they start with a drive letter, and then there's a colon, and then there's backslashes. For some backwards compatibility with NT, // often work, but not always. And you don't have a root directory. You have a root directory per drive. And in the root directory, that's not where Git lives. It lives somewhere completely different. So in msys2 bash, when you go to the root directory, it actually expands to the Windows path to the installation. And to support shell scripting better, msys2 tries to convert between Windows and Unix paths on the fly. And sometimes when you pass, for example, a regular expression which starts with a /, and that gets converted to a Windows path, that's just wrong. So that's a problem. Another problem there was that, or still is, that unsigned long data types are really not well defined. We know actually for 20 years that we should not use unsigned long. We should always use uint32_t or something like that in order to say this is the bit width. Yet Git was still developed with using unsigned long as the data types. And that means that on Linux, where this expands to 64-bit in 64-bit setups, you can address 64-bit. On Windows, it's 32-bit, no matter whether your operating system is 32-bit or 64-bit. But that means that you cannot internally represent memory larger than 4 GB, which means that you can't expand objects in Git for Windows that are larger than 4 GB. Now, that's not source code if you ask me if it's that large, but people track those types of binary data in the Git repositories, and we have almost no understanding in the Git project of those challenges. Now, even more challenges are the cultural challenges. As I said previously, Windows users often come with the idea that, hey, I tell you what's wrong and you fix it for me, and then the transaction is done. Because many Windows users are used to service contracts, and that's just how things are done there. And the Git project and the Git for Windows project, it's not done that way. I can't do that for every Git for Windows user. We have probably something like 3 to 10 million Git for Windows users. I'm just one person. I can't do that. So This is a challenge, especially when you then go to the Git mailing list and they say, yeah, why don't they fix them themselves? That won't work. Also, these culture wars that have unfortunately traditionally been reinforced by management in Microsoft, like the open source cancer and evil Microsoft. This is still stuck in heads, even half a decade after, or more than half a decade of really, really good interaction between Microsoft and the open source world. And there are more things like that. It's these understandings need to be carefully honed. The people have to want to meet the other people where they are. And this is a collaboration challenge that I think might not be solvable by technology. So the Git for Windows project is probably the wrong venue to solve this, but it is definitely something that we have to deal with. Well, with that, I would like to thank you and just give you the advice. It is challenging to collaborate, especially cross-platform, but in the end, your software will be better for it.
We are so proud to be able to say, Johannes, thank you for being part of GitCon 2021. I was so honored that you even wrote me back, to be honest with you. It's just to fanboy out for a second. It's one of those projects I've used for so long and know so many people that have touched that it's just kind of an honor to talk to you today. So just get that out of the way first, and now we'll...
Well, thank you so much.
Sorry, I mispronounced your last name when we started there.
Don't worry. Don't worry. Happens all the time. Even Germans mispronounce my surname, so you're fine.
That does make me feel a little bit better. We did have a number of questions out there. So you had already addressed this one, but just say to share with the world what's going on in conversation there on Discord. Working at Microsoft, do you ever get the attitude like Linux is a cancer from anyone out there?
Yeah. I mean, when I started, if I had gotten that vibe from the managers that I talked to or the other developers, I would not have been in favor of starting there. So already from the get-go, I got that feeling like everybody was really more interested in working together. Like there was more the sentiment out, what can we do in order to profit using Linux and the open source world at large, but also in order for this to be maintainable, sustainable, what can we do to make this work? What can we contribute back? And a large part of that was my first interviewer said fair and square, this is our attempt, is one of our attempts to really connect to the open source world by paying people like you to work full-time on open source. So that this can actually work, but because I entered into an org that was very much connected to the Azure cloud. So they were not so much of the, hey, Linux, the competition ideas flying around, but their idea was more like, hey, we can put Windows on the cloud, we can put Linux on the cloud. When we get the proper hardware for licensing reasons, we can also get macOS there. And let's just make this work for everybody, because then we can make the most money, right? And we can make the most money with everybody being happy about it, because we give something and we provide a really good, fantastic service. Like the original idea of Azure was we make the world's computer, right? So everything's supposed to run in Azure. And as a consequence, I mean, you can see it these days. I feel really validated that the GitHub Actions are free of charge for all the open source projects. And I think this is an incredible value that's added there. And it's only possible because, yes, Microsoft makes enough money to actually keep Azure running, because GitHub Actions in the background, of course, it runs on Azure. So I have not heard anything close to that, even from my contacts in the Windows org that say Linux is cancer. To the contrary, some people just ask me, how can we contribute without coming over as these Microsoft people who try to embrace, extend, and then extinguish? Because we want this to work long term, right? And I had many, many conversations like that where I thought, how the hell would I know? How would I know how to connect to the open source community? I am in the open source community and I'm connected to you, but I don't know how the others react. But no, it's been very positive.
Well, right on. That's very positive to hear. I know. Well, at the end of the day, you got to pay your developers, you got to pay your staff, and
Yeah, I couldn't spend vacation right now if I didn't make enough money to pay for their flight, right?
Yes. Thank you very much for taking the time. I don't think that came up in Discord out there, but you're taking some personal time from your vacation to be here at GitCon, and we couldn't again thank you enough. That's amazing.
Well, to be honest, I really only took the vacation so I could get into the right time zone to spend time with you guys. Sorry, you folks.
Well, we wish we could do it in person. We really do. All right, so let's move on. We do a few more questions in about the 8 minutes we got left. With Windows subsystem for Linux available on Windows, does it mean that Git for Windows will eventually no longer be a thing? If Linux Git can be used directly?
Yeah, so WSL, Windows Subsystem Linux, really started out as something like, how can we attract more people who are used to the command line, where Windows is traditionally very weak, to the Windows platform? And it started out as really that subsystem where it runs directly on top of the NT kernel, right? But of course, that had to be done on a very new Windows version in order to make this work. It's Windows 10, and it's not the first Windows 10 version, because every half year there's a new Windows 10 version, and a couple of them are long-term support. So that means there are plenty of Windows users out there still who have no access to WSL. There's also the thing that in order to use Windows Subsystem Linux, you have to switch on the developer mode, for which you have to be the administrator, right? And also, if you have Windows 10S, that very secure and very tamped down version, you can't do it. You can't even enable it. So there are problems that WSL poses, so hurdles that you have to overcome first in order to use it. Once you have overcome them, it's great. I use it myself every day. Plenty of even Git development I do in WSL, because it's just, Git is more native to Linux than to Windows. So it's much faster to just do complete test suite run. And so I think in the long term, WSL will have more and more share, but there will always be occasions when you will want to use Git for Windows instead, be it the size of the installation, the requirement to first enable developer mode, be it a new Windows version, right? Or be it that just plain you use it in a corporation where they're totally unwilling to let you use Linux because they have no expertise to keep you safe. On Windows, there are plenty of anti-malware software. On Linux, I think the only one that I know, well, I shouldn't say names, right? I don't want to advise that, but I'm only aware of one provider for anti-malware on Linux. And so there will be always occasions when Git for Windows is just the thing that's easier to install, even if it might not be as fast as it could potentially be, but this is what you use.
Oh, right on. It's an interesting world with Linux and anti-spam, anti-malware, all of that. There used to be the argument that it was just too small of a vector to worry about, but now, as basically all the back ends of all the things are Linux. That is no longer the case. That's an interesting point. So I did have another question right here. Let me find the right Chiron here at the back of the page. There it is. Found the right one. Does the Git integration inside Visual Studio use the same Git for Windows code CLI, or is it a different implementation? Do you happen to know that?
As far as I know, VS Code actually uses the Git executable that it finds on the path. So yes, it would be the very same Git for Windows that you installed. I'm not aware of them bundling anything. So Git for Windows comes in several flavors, and one of them is MinGit, which is relatively small. It's a 25 megabyte zip that you can unpack, but it doesn't have any interactive functionality. So that's what Visual Studio itself bundles. That's what GitHub Desktop bundles. And I'm sure there are other software that I forgot that also bundle this as a way to come with Git support and not requiring you to install Git for Windows. But I think VS Code, as far as I understand, requires you to install a system Git, which on Windows would be Git for Windows.
That's one of the advantages we have at GitKraken is we don't require a Linux install. I'm sorry, we don't require a Linux install at all, but we also don't require Git install is what I meant.
Right,
We're at the end of the day here. Because we're using libgit 2, which we're going to hear much more about tomorrow in our keynote. I'm very excited. Edward Thompson,
yes.
the man who was the product manager for GitHub Actions. Anyway, we're not here to talk about him.
No, but tune in. Edward is great. He's a much better speaker than I. So if you have been put to sleep by me, just wait for his talk. He's entertaining.
I'm sure no one's been put to sleep, but it's riveting. Here, not a question, but that's the wrong one. I just wanted to pass along some praise you got out there, so people watching this later will be able to see it. Thanks so much for enabling us to not miss the Git train, especially the .NET developers of the world. It really has made a huge impact, and just want to say, thank you on that.
Well, you're welcome.
Closing remarks here. Is there anything else you want to say to the Git world at large? Any parting knowledge you want to say before we get out of here today?
Well, I'm really excited to work in this field, and I think there's so much still to do. And quite honestly, there's a lot of things that I imagine should be done in the Git world where the expertise is not even available right now. So if you know, for example, how to develop better UIs, such as GitKraken, or how to improve even the command line experience of Git, which leaves to be desired, if we're honest, just go ahead. I'm excited to see what you build on top of Git or into Git.
So as someone that's contributed yourself, that's always good advice. Like, go contribute. That's one of from my experience in Drupal and WordPress. It's always like, get involved. So do you have any advice for someone that is just starting out? And how do I get involved? What's the easiest way? Just to ask?
Well, the first thing is do have an itch that you need to scratch. Like if you work with Git, there's certainly something that you could be better. And if you have a good idea how it could be better, then just work on that, right? So if, for example, if you work on GitKraken and you think that the libgit 2 things are somewhat limited, for example, that they lack support for a certain feature that Git introduced very recently, then work with the libgit 2 crowd. They are really fantastic to work with, very friendly. I would say even friendlier than the Git mailing list, because they do accept contributions a little bit more liberally. You don't have to send them as email. But even if you want to improve the Git command line interface, like Git core Git, my advice is just have something that you want to solve, and then maybe bring a little bit of resilience. There are a couple people who might not react the way you think they should react. Most of them are friendly, though, and helpful. And once you find out how to contribute, and people will help you to find out exactly how you should do things like tabs, not spaces, right? These stupid little details that just get in your way. There are people who will help you with that. And just be a little bit patient with the Git contributors, and you will get your contribution in, and it will be great.
Definitely patience will pay off. So thank you very much, Johannes. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on First Ever GitCon.
Thank you for having me, Dwayne. Thanks for the invitation.